Go ahead and get welfare, you poor thing. Ha ha. After those words, the two of them left the house. I felt all the strength leave my body and slumped down on the spot. I couldn't help but remember what Greg had said earlier. While you are indeed independent, I've always felt like my pride as a man has been hurt. From now on, I will build a family with my sister-in-law, no, with Brandy. So please, let's get a divorce. I became indifferent to everything and signed the divorce papers to indicate my intention to divorce. Sometime later, I decided to demand property division from them, and we had a meeting with a lawyer present. Brazenly, an unrelated sister demanded a share of the assets. However, the lawyer burst into laughter and said, "Aren't you the one on welfare?" Caught off guard by the sudden turn of events, my sister made a baffled face and let out a ridiculous scream. Immediately after seeing the documents the lawyer had placed on the table, my sister turned pale. My name is Erin Anderson. My husband Greg and I have been married for 18 years. I am 45 years old, while Greg is 3 years younger at 42. We have one daughter, Jenny, who is currently 17 years old and in her second year of high school. She is facing an important period with her exams coming up next year. Greg and I met through work. I was working at a real estate company, and Greg was employed at a related company. We hit it off over something trivial and frequently went out in our private lives. Greg is very sensitive and often struggles to make decisions decisively. At the time, I found his indecisiveness endearing and was drawn to him. I wanted to take care of Greg and did so purely because I have a much younger brother. Initially, I saw Greg as a brother and took care of him, but gradually I was attracted to his more masculine sides. After a serious relationship, we got married. Greg, who was usually indecisive, took the initiative to confess and propose. In situations where decisions had to be made, he did so properly. That gap made me feel that I could marry him and be okay. We had Jenny without experiencing any serious arguments or crisis of divorce. I thought that once Jenny became an adult, we would start our second life as a couple. "Hey, Erin, can I stay here for a bit?" That was until my sister Brandy showed up unannounced with a large suitcase. Besides my brother, I have another sibling, which is the sister standing before me. We get along well with my brother due to the age difference. However, my sister, who is close in age to me, and I have always had a poor relationship. I was always smaller and ended up wearing my sister's hand-me-downs. When our parents felt sorry and bought me a new toy, she would say, "Aw, lucky. Give me one too," and snatch the new doll I had received, replacing it with her old worn-out doll. Her tyranny didn't stop there. Taking things was still on the cuter side. When I entered elementary school, she took all my friends, and when I got my first boyfriend in high school, she seduced him away. I hated her so much that I went to a different university to avoid her, but she still interfered with my life, ruining what should have been a fun college life. I still dislike my sister to this day. If possible, I don't want anything to do with her. So I studied hard, obtained my real estate license, moved to New York, and lived a life without seeing my sister. For our wedding, Greg and I decided to have a photo wedding just for the two of us. Knowing my sister's personality, my parents kept my marriage a secret. Despite my hopes, my sister found out about my presence here. I was looking forward to having some time for myself and my husband once Jenny went to college. "Wow, Erin, you live in a pretty nice house for yourself. Is it a single-family home? Did you buy it? Oh, there's a room available here. I'll be using this one, thanks." I was snapped back to reality by my sister's shrill voice. "Hey, this is really inconvenient. You can't just show up and expect to stay. My husband and daughter live here too, you know." My sister ignored my words and started looking around the house. Today was a holiday, but Jenny was out attending classes, and Greg had left early in the morning for work. Could you please leave before the two of them come back? I pleaded with her repeatedly, but my sister wouldn't listen. Finally, in the evening, both of them came home. Who might this be? Greg, who looked puzzled, asked. My sister greeted him with a charm that belied her 46 years. Nice to meet you. I'm Aaron's sister, Brandy. When did you two get married? I had no idea, no greetings or anything. I was visiting our parents' house and found your photo wedding pictures in Mom's room by chance. It's so cold of you, keeping it from your own sister. Greg knew I had a sister, so he looked slightly troubled, probably thinking she was exactly as I had described. But I didn't miss it. Greg was slightly smitten by my beautiful sister. Jenny, returning home to a confused scene, must have been surprised. Suddenly, an aunt they had never met before had invaded our home. However, my sister pushed forward with the idea of moving in. Actually, I got fired, and it's been tough managing rent and living expenses, so I was wondering if I could stay here for a bit. Well, if it's just for a little while, I guess it's okay. What? Now is not the time. Jenny has her exams next year, a critical time. I tried to say that, but the two of them didn't listen to me and got carried away. Actually, Erin told me about her sister. That's okay. Erin probably avoided talking about me, so you went along with it, right? Sorry about my sister. This marked the beginning of a tumultuous daily life. My sister demanded money without doing any chores, and even started taking cash from my wallet. This all happened within just 1 week of her moving in. I had repeatedly warned her about this behavior, but she didn't listen. Hey, if you need money, at least tell me what you're buying or why you need it. Don't just take it from my wallet without asking. What? Why do I need to report to you what I'm buying? Because it's my money. If she was fired, I wish she would job hunt and leave our house quickly. However, it didn't seem like she was looking for a job, and recently, Greg and Brandy's schedules have been suspiciously overlapping. Greg claimed he was working overtime, but his salary never reflected any overtime pay. I confronted him about it. Your salary doesn't include overtime, does it? If you can't ask for overtime pay, should I ask on your behalf? What, are you doubting me? I'm properly paid for my overtime separate from my salary, so there's no issue. Greg, usually mild-mannered, raised his voice for the first time. This was shocking enough for me, as Greg wasn't someone who resorted to emotional arguments or sudden outbursts. From this point, I started to feel a crisis looming over our current lifestyle. My sister continued to laze around the house, costing more money than even Jenny consumed, leaving me with nothing but sighs. I discussed this matter with our parents. They apologized for their lack of oversight, which led to my sister finding out about my marriage and our home, but the fault wasn't with my parents. Despite the distance from my dear parents, I lived quietly with my husband and daughter, yet my sister became obsessed enough to track down our home. She must have been preparing to find out where we lived the moment she discovered the photo wedding pictures Greg and I took. I'm sure she's thinking of taking my things and making me miserable again. I've even begun to doubt whether her claim of being fired is true. Perhaps she quit her job on purpose to freeload at our place and ruin my life. This began to seem like a possibility. If that's the case, I need to kick my sister out of the house as soon as possible. Hey, you said you got fired, but if you were enrolled in employment insurance, wouldn't you be eligible for unemployment benefits? I've always been working part-time, so I wasn't in anything like that. That's why I'm in trouble. I could have gone back to our parents' house, but I can't just make our elderly parents take care of me, right? So as the independent sister, you should take responsibility. That's common sense. I was speechless at her nonsensical statement. After dropping out of college, Brandy had always worked part-time and never as a full-time employee. Learning this fact later made me realize why her job hunting wasn't going well. Then 3 months after Brandy began freeloading, I caught Greg and her in an affair. I had been suspicious, but to actually see them cheating. A meeting was canceled, and while killing time in a cafe, I saw Greg and Brandy walking together, hand in hand, chatting happily. It's inconceivable for a brother-in-law and sister-in-law to hold hands like that. At that moment, I was certain they were having an affair. After a while, when I had made up my mind, I confronted them at home. So the overtime was a lie, huh? And you, pretending to job hunt while actually hanging out with Greg. The worst. Even at this age, you can't be satisfied without taking something from me, can you? That's why I kept my marriage a secret from you. I exploded with emotion. They casually admitted to the affair, then began to say even more infuriating things. If I had known such a beautiful woman was your sister, I wouldn't have avoided her just because you told me to. Aaron, you're indeed independent, but I've always felt my pride as a man was being hurt. From now on, I want to build a family with my sister-in-law. No, with Brandy. So let's get a divorce. He then pushed a divorce paper towards me, already filled out in Greg's section. Fine, there's no way we can rebuild this. Brandy, Greg, from now on, I won't be responsible for your financial support, so just know that. Brandy then laughed out loud and said, "Go ahead and get welfare. You poor thing." What? As I wondered what she meant, Greg, half smiling, added something even more appalling. "Oh, that's right. Since custody usually favors the mother, it's better for our daughter to be with you, Aaron. Do whatever you want from now on." With those words, they left the house. A few minutes later, Jenny came home and was puzzled by the quietness of the house. I honestly told her that we were getting a divorce. Initially shocked, Jenny seemed somewhat relieved as she accepted the situation. After a while, the divorce was finalized. I decided to discuss compensation with them in the presence of a lawyer I hired. Shamelessly, Brandy demanded a division of assets. However, the lawyer burst into laughter and said, "Aren't you the one who should be on welfare?" Caught off guard by the sudden turn of events, Brandy made a baffled face and let out a ridiculous scream. Immediately after seeing the documents the lawyer placed on the table, Brandy turned pale. This couple doesn't have the kind of money that can be divided. Brandy looked shocked as she glanced back and forth between Greg and me. Of course, Greg was also surprised to hear that we hardly had any assets. Anticipating this, I had taken certain actions immediately after witnessing Greg and Brandy's affair. Therefore, the only cash between us was a mere $112,000. For a couple celebrating their 18th wedding anniversary, it's a hard-to-believe amount. Hey, what's going on? You had a lot of savings, didn't you? Greg, completely bewildered, asked this in a panic. Seeing him like that, I felt a surge of anger. You really have no interest in Jenny, do you? We talked about this. I said I've been saving up for her education, but now I'm thinking of transferring it to Jenny's account. You told me to do as I wish, so I transferred almost all of my savings to Jenny's account for her education. You should know this better than anyone. Jenny is managing her own money, and even after paying gift tax. It's no longer considered our savings. I said this with a composed face. Greg's complexion turned visibly worse as he remembered the conversation. Then what's the breakdown of the $112,000? Greg asked. About 80% of it is probably your secret savings, I replied. Saying this, Greg looked at me as if wondering how I knew about it. You knew about it and transferred your savings to Jenny, anticipating the division of property. You agreed to it, remember? You even signed the consent form. At this, Greg became furious. I thought it was strange. Why would you ask for my consent just for that? Greg said, frantically scratching his head, clearly regretting his actions. But it was too late to take back his signature. The lawyer confirmed that since Greg had agreed to the gift to Jenny, it was no longer considered marital savings. I didn't want to give such money to these two. That's why I thought of making a living gift, I explained. Hearing this, Brandy was dumbfounded, but somehow managed to say to Greg, "Hey, you said we had plenty of savings. Weren't we supposed to live a luxurious life together? Dividing $112,000 won't amount to much. Why didn't you realize Aaron's intentions sooner?" Brandy reproached Greg, her face turning pale, but Greg avoided her gaze and kept silent. Greg had been earning little and had a considerable amount of student loans, so he hardly contributed to the living expenses after our marriage. However, this was agreed upon. When Greg mentioned it was difficult for him to contribute to living expenses, I said, "All right, I'll manage all the living expenses, so could you focus on saving money for our old age as much as possible?" Thus, I had been covering all living expenses for over a decade. Greg thought he had been able to save at least $1,000 or more, but when it was revealed it was less than $10,000, I was shocked. I had thought saving would be easy, since he didn't have to pay living expenses, but Greg had been secretly squandering money. I felt betrayed when I accidentally saw his bank book left on the desk and learned of the savings amount. However, now that we're divorced, such matters no longer concern me. Brandy, finally grasping the severity of the situation, trembled slightly, trying hard to think of what to do next, but apparently came up with nothing. Knowing that the cash available for division was only $122,000, and seeing Brandy's confusion, I decided to reveal another truth. I looked towards Greg and said, "I was debating whether to say this, but Greg, aren't you planning to quit your job?" At that moment, our eyes met squarely. Greg, visibly shaken, glanced left and right before exclaiming, "How do you know I'm planning to quit my job? I only talked about it with the boss." I thought so after seeing the payroll slip. My observation was based on the fact that no overtime pay was being paid. But actually, I found it strange looking at a certain section. This is about the use of paid leave. Greg, who used to work for a real estate company and now works for a construction company, has never taken more than the minimum required 5 days of paid leave. However, recent pay slips revealed that Greg had taken a bunch of paid leave all at once, which usually suggests resignation. At this time, I was already suspecting their affair, wondering if Greg decided to quit his job thinking he would get a large sum of money after divorcing me. To my surprise, this guess was right on the mark. I couldn't help but sigh at Greg's overly optimistic thinking. "Well, you are my husband, so you should at least know what job I do, and how much wealth I've accumulated. To think you relied on that, cheated, and even chose to resign. You really haven't thought this through," I said. Greg's face turned red. The lawyer's remark to Brandy, asking if she was the one on welfare, meant that if the two unemployed individuals came together, they would end up on welfare unless they worked. Brandy, flustered by this realization, suddenly shouted, "Wait a minute. If you can prepare for Jenny's college expenses and cover living costs all by yourself, there must be something fishy. I get it, you're hiding assets, right? That's the only explanation. Come on, confess now." Hearing her words, Greg seemed to have an epiphany. "That's right, Brandy. Actually, Aaron owns a lot of real estate, so we have to divide those assets too. Close call, I almost got tricked. Real estate is a significant asset, and we need to split it fairly between us. You've been acting all high and mighty, but you're also using sneaky tactics. Watching the two of them laughing about this, I was just dumbfounded. The lawyer couldn't help but chuckle at their ignorance. The tension in the room heightened. The lawyer cleared his throat and began to speak plainly. If we're going to talk about the division of property, you should study up a bit more, Greg. As the ex-husband, you should know that Erin owns real estate through her company, generating profit. A corporation and an individual are separate entities. Erin's company is her separate property, and it cannot be divided as marital property. The professionals have spoken, and there's no mistake. Realizing this, the two of them turned red and were speechless. The lawyer continued, "What can be considered for division are things like cars, houses, and cash savings. Moreover, Greg and Brandy have virtually admitted to their affair, allowing Erin to demand compensation from you too. Let's say $10,000 from Greg and $3,000 from Brandy." As soon as they heard this, their faces contorted. Isn't that too high? It was just a few months' affair, they protested. Yeah, isn't this normally not as much as $10,000? They seemed not to have expected such a turn of events and began making excuses. However, I immediately countered, "Who decided that? The market is just a reference. Greg, you took leave to secretly date my sister, and she didn't even bother to properly job hunt, instead choosing to live off my money." The lawyer objectively assessed the situation and decided on this amount. What would you have preferred, a higher amount? At that, they hastily shook their heads no. The discussion couldn't be concluded in just one day and was adjourned. But I felt a firm respect response. 2 weeks later, we convened again for discussions. Brandy, with a defiant attitude, said, "Give me the house and the regular car." Is that what you call compensatory property division? Then give Greg's $122,000 to him, and I'll pay the remaining $1,000. Okay. Hearing such nonsensical demands, I was about to yell in anger, but managed to control myself with reason, and slowly sorted out the situation. The house still had a mortgage and required maintenance regularly, so it would have some value if sold. The car was also relatively new, purchased just 5 years ago. Accepting my sister's proposal would mean a loss for me, which I absolutely did not want. Sister, did you even do the math? If you consider selling the house and car, you wouldn't say such things. Usually, it's not the cheating party, you guys, who should be making these demands. It's me, as I pondered how brazen they could be. Greg, sitting next to my sister, overlapped my words with his own, beginning to say something else. You own assets worth $170 million in the company, right? I don't care if you're some real estate mogul or whatever, but being so stingy with all that wealth is just insane. Caught off guard for a moment, I ended up laughing at their absurdity, given the situation. Seeing me suddenly burst into laughter made the two of them freeze. After a good laugh, I returned to a serious expression. So is that all you wanted to say? And why are you acting like you're the victims here? Stingy? I'd rather be stingy than give any money to a man who abandons his daughter for an affair, or to the worst kind of sister who steals her sibling's husband. I'd rather secure as much as possible for Jenny. They flinched at my words. I wanted to tell them to study more about legal terms if they wanted to use them. What were they even thinking, saying such things? I planned to dismantle their delusions bit by bit. Greg, this house is under my name, right? I know that, but we've lived together here, Greg interjected. So what? It's my separate property since I bought it with a mortgage before we got married. No matter how you twist it, it remains mine, I clarified. The car, bought new, is accident-free and of a model that sells well. If you want it, you'll have to pay me half its appraised value. That's how property division works. We own 2 cars. One is the new car currently being discussed, the other a used compact car. Probably wouldn't fetch much, but the lawyer said houses and cars are subject to property division. Brandy added. She said this without thinking it through, but that's not what it meant. Look, the lawyer was just mentioning the main things subject to property division, not that they'd necessarily be divided in our case. All we have to divide between us is the $112,000 from Greg's secret savings in my savings, plus the 2 cars. That's it, I explained. Naturally, Brandy was clueless, and Greg hadn't thought it through, landing them in trouble again. Greg pleaded with me after showing some semblance of thought. Can you just give us enough money to start our new life? Please. His apology seemed superficial. He just wanted to solve the immediate problem. I don't need such a shallow apology. I steeled my heart and responded. Given your attitude, it seems like you wouldn't want to pay for Jenny's child support either. There's not a single thing I'm willing to compromise on. Why should I have to worry about your living expenses? I firmly stated my position, and realizing they couldn't persuade me further, they reluctantly signed the necessary documents. Sometime after the divorce and property division were settled, Brandy called me repeatedly, complaining, "Why did Greg have so much debt? You were paying the living expenses, right? Then why would he need to borrow money? What's going on?" She was frantic over the phone. I patiently explained the reality to her that should have been obvious when it came out that he only had less than $10,000 saved despite having years to save. Maybe he made some big purchases on credit or something like that, I suggested. As I asked this, Brandy eagerly shared her situation. Yes, he took loans of several thousands to buy nonsensical brand items. And it turns out his credit card was set to revolving payments, without him knowing, making a huge mess. So this guy is just a debt disaster. How could you push such a person onto me? Push onto you? You're the one who stole him, remember. I couldn't help but retort with a half-laugh, and Brandy fell silent. It seems Greg had been accumulating debts I wasn't even aware of. Now demand letters are arriving in droves. He must have been careless with his address change, or perhaps in the chaos of starting a new life, he forgot to hide them. Oh, and there's one more thing I haven't told you, Brandy, I continued. What now? Brandy was utterly terrified. But hearing about the debt made me recall something Greg had mentioned. He was working in construction now as a sole proprietor. While this meant his income and residence taxes were deducted, he was responsible for managing other necessary payments himself. Being self-employed, I handled my national pension and health insurance. And when Greg left his job in real estate, I made arrangements for Jenny to be covered by the national health insurance as well. I took care of my taxes and such. But it turned out Greg hadn't paid his national pension for a year since he switched jobs, I explained. I was covering the health insurance, so there was no issue there. Due to some mistake, a national pension demand notice was sent to our house. I contacted Greg and got his permission to open it. And it was indeed a demand notice he had been hiding all along, and I hadn't noticed. I pay my own national pension and assumed Greg was paying his. When I called Greg about opening the demand notice, he almost cried and begged for help. National pension costs that much. You're kidding, right? I can't pay this. We were a family, weren't we? Can't you do something, please? What? You have the nerve to say that. The very person who abandoned his wife and child is asking for help. My logic left Greg speechless again. Realizing there was no way out, Brandy seemed to lose all hope over the phone as well. So you'll have to figure it out yourselves. I ended the call eventually. Greg called, complaining about the high taxes on the car I had taken, and how expensive the vehicle inspection was. Maintaining a car costs this much. I thought taxes were just a few $10, but they're in the hundreds, and the vehicle inspection costs so much. Hog, it's tough, isn't it? Can't you take it back? No, after I curtly refused, Greg hung up deflated. He kept sending emails asking for help, but when I warned him that any more harassment would lead me to report him for stalking, he stopped. Brandy and Greg were in for a hell worse than hell itself. They ended up divorcing after only 3 months of marriage. Immediately following our divorce, their plan had been doomed from the start. When they realized the house under my name wasn't part of the assets to be divided, their marriage was never going to work. With tens of thousands in debt and compensation to pay, their divorce was more tumultuous than my own. With Greg, Brandy was always fixated on money. Sell the new car. It's a waste to keep something like that. Might as well cash it in, right? What? I don't care about that petty cash. Besides, I paid your compensation in full, so if we're splitting, you owe me that money. They couldn't finalize their divorce because of such petty arguments. Eventually, Greg chose to declare bankruptcy, unaffectedly by me since I had already collected the lump sum compensation. Greg ended up jobless and penniless, leading him to homelessness. He couldn't retract his statement about quitting his job and left the company. Pride prevented him from applying for welfare, and now he's likely living a miserable life, begging on the streets. Brandy faced divine retribution after stealing her sister's husband and divorcing in just 3 months. Her social relationships crumbled, disowned by family and relatives. She struggled with job hunting due to her attitude. Even when she managed to get part-time jobs, her domineering nature and refusal to accept fault led to immediate dismissals. The lawyer's warning about welfare became reality. Brandy, clinging to her possessions, was ineligible for welfare, evicted from her apartment, and became homeless like Greg. They trampled on the feelings of both me and Jenny with their selfish actions, so this punishment was only natural. Now it's just the two of us living together, but our days haven't changed much. Jenny said she felt relieved after Greg, who never did anything for her yet, always complained about studying and going to a good university, was gone. And then she splendidly passed the entrance exam to an Ivy League university. Seeing my daughter about to start her college life this fall fills me with renewed emotion. As I near 46, busy in a good way with work, and still healthy, I'm motivated to keep pushing forward.